Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about the digestive system now. And one of the things I want to say as I get started is I'm trying to tell you a story of how food turns into you. So you ingest food, whatever your choice is, your body breaks that food apart and turns it into smaller and smaller and smaller units till it becomes a molecular unit that then can be absorbed into the bloodstream. So you can think that food that you just ate becomes something that's small enough that can be absorbed through a single cell into the bloodstream. So in doing that, I will probably seem like I'm repeating a lot of information, but that's not the worst thing in the world because it's information that sometimes doesn't go readily into your head. So if you listen to it, and maybe if I come at it from a different way. So in a way, I'm apologizing in advance in the fact that there will seem like there's some repetition here, but I'm trying to just make sure it gets in your head pretty well. We'll start out just generally. The digestive system functions. It gives you the capacity to ingest food. It does this because your digestive system and mine, it's an open tube. It's an open tube to the outside world. So you have this ability, you have a hold for the food to come in. So ingest food, digest food. So break it apart, absorb that, and then eliminate anything that is in that food that your body can't use, so the waste products. So kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the ingestion of food, the digestion of food, the absorption of nutrients, and then the elimination of that which you can't use. One of the first things that you talk about in an anatomy class is the actual anatomy. And I'll repeat this image several times because it becomes something that is very testable and you want to get in your head. But it's probably not the more complex portion of this material, but you want to get this in your head so you kind of get a picture of what's happening where. Food is ingested via the mouth, and so you have the oral cavity, you have the teeth, the tongue. What happens in the mouth is the beginning of mechanical digestion, so the breaking of food apart, and then also some chemical digestion with the secretions from the salivary glands. The food then goes down the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube that leads the food to the stomach. So the stomach is actually on the right, so you see the stomach there. And what happens in the stomach, because it's so acidic, the environment, is you start breaking down proteins and breaking bonds and materials, but mostly those protein bonds. After the stomach, the food goes into the small intestines. It's actually the last portion on the right. And the first portion of the small intestines is called the duodenal ampulla. And in that area, that's where the liver, which going back to the left, which makes bile, however, is stored in the gallbladder and released from the gallbladder, releases bile into the duodenal ampulla. The other thing is going back to the right side, the pancreas then comes in and releases pancreatic enzymes to act on that material that just came out of the stomach. The material that came out of the stomach, which is called chyme at that time, makes its way through these small intestines. It's more and more broken down to the point where everything is taken out of that food substance that can be used by the body. The only thing that's left is that which needs to be eliminated, and water. And so then that material moves on to the large intestines via the ascending, transverse, and descending portion of the large intestines. In the portion of that, what happens is food is dehydrated, the water's taken out, it's compacted, some vitamins are made, and then goes to the tube, the end of the tube, which we call the anus, and then eliminated from yourself. We organize those parts of the digestive system into the GI tract itself. And by the way, the GI tract has many AKAs, the alimentary canal, the GI tract, and sometimes even the digestive system kind of gets thrown in there with that word, but it's not quite accurate. You have those portions proper generally listed, and then you have the accessory organs. One of the reasons why they're accessory organs is because they function in other systems also, and they aren't part of the actual tube system. You have the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, large intestines, and anus as part of the GI tract. And then the accessory organs: teeth, tongue, salivary glands, gallbladder, liver, and pancreas. So kind of a way to organize it in your head. And then with regard to the digestive process, we generally break it down into 6 major functions. Ingestion clearly happens in the mouth. This idea of propulsion, the tube, which we call the GI tract tube, is lined by smooth muscle that contracts and allows whatever form that food is at that time, whether it's a bolus, whether it's chyme, whether it's a liquid, propels it along. You have mechanical digestion, so you're actually breaking things apart smaller and smaller. You have chemical digestion, where you actually have an enzyme or an acid acting on the bonds of that particular macromolecule, and breaking those bonds to make that macromolecule a smaller and smaller increment. Absorption, and that absorption can be simple diffusion. Remember, diffusion is where something goes from down a concentration gradient, so from a high concentration to a low concentration. So it can be diffusion, or there can be activities where you have active transport, where you actually have protein carriers that will take it through a channel and into either the bloodstream or the lymphatic system. And then you have the elimination, which is defecation. Each of these processes are a little bit more involved than I've spoken so far, but sometimes I think that as you are trying to absorb the minutia of these processes, coming back to this overview might help you. So you'll say, oh, that's where I am. Okay, and that's what happened just before that. So some of my repeating of images and repeating of thoughts is so that you can remember where you are with regard to this digestive process. And here I've just written it out a little bit so you can read back. The ingestion, bringing food in; propulsion, moving it forward. Mechanical digestion is the actual ripping apart or changing from large to small. Generally the teeth do this. Churning in the stomach, and then mixing food with digestive juices can break it apart. Chemical digestion, again, it's more enzymes, acids, digestive juices, and absorption into the GI tract. One of the things, might add to that are the different types of absorption. Different nutrients are absorbed in different ways, and we will talk about that. And then defecation, which is a complex reflex that has local control and also a CNS control with regard to defecation. And then again, and hopefully you understand what I'm saying is with regard to what we're just telling the story with a little bit more detail each time we tell it, I guess. That's might be what I'm saying. Is kind of an overview. Think about yourself. Think about when you smell bread. Well, bread, or smell whatever your favorite thing is with regard to smelling. Bread to me is a good one to use because it does have, particularly if it's baking, it does have such a fragrance, even if you're not particularly somebody who ingests in carbohydrates. And this might be a multi-grain bread, so it's not simple carbs. The body, what happens is your CNS responds, so you get ready for digestion, and that response is a release of saliva. You can feel that in your mouth. Salivary glands release They release serous fluid and mucus. The mucus is going to actually emulse into the food and make a nice mix into the food. You also have amylase, and remember, anytime you have an ASE at the end of a word, that means it's an enzyme. So amylase is going to break down carbohydrates or begin to break down carbohydrates. And just a little bit of a reminder, remember, carbohydrates are long chains of monoglyceride, long chains of what eventually becomes glucose. I want to make sure I say that. So you have these long chains that can be broken down into shorter chains. So this amylase isn't finishing the digestion of carbohydrates, but getting it started. And then the same thing with lipase, is starting the chemical breaking down of fats, of lipids. And then the stomach starts to churn, and that movement of the muscles of the stomach is because of CNS intervention, so central nervous system intervention, and then also that churning turns the chemicals on that are going to be released by the stomach. So it gets the stomach ready for food. Pancreas and gallbladder get put on alert. This is all happening while you're smelling, and then those are controlled by the CNS, controlled by this thought: I get to eat. I get to eat that thing that smells really good. Then when you first eat the bread, so you taste it, again, more secretion from the salivary glands, chewing, mastication, mixing the food with the tongue, so chewing and also moving the food around with your tongue, and then a more contraction of the stomach, because what's going to happen is you're going to swallow that food that you chewed. That's going to go down the esophagus and eventually make its way into the stomach, and the stomach it needs to be ready to start working on it. And then again, the pancreas and gallbladder are on alert. When you swallow, the tongue, now the food has been broken up and mixed with digestive enzymes and mucus, so it's turned into a bolus. It moves into the oropharynx, so it moves from the mouth to the oropharynx. Then you have skeletal muscles, and these are smooth, these are skeletal muscles that actually, with regard to the pharynx, you can control them, so they are somewhat voluntary, but they're also somewhat involuntary. And then you have smooth muscle with regard to the esophagus. So once that food gets past the pharynx into the esophagus, it's going down because of the smooth muscle. That's an autonomic. Those muscles contract in a method we call peristalsis. And there are glands in the esophagus to moisten the food, so basically it doesn't cause harm to the tissue of the esophagus. And then onto what happens when the stomach gets into what happens when the bread gets into the stomach. The food then mixing via muscle contractions, and you have 3 layers of muscles on the stomach. We'll look at those in later pictures, but you have layers going lengthwise, oblique, and circular. So the stomach mixes in multiple ways, in multiple directions, the mix. There's also a release of hydrogen and chloride ions that become that lower the pH of that which came in, and also kills bacteria. It degrades food, and you have the release of your first chemical called pepsinogen. And remember, whenever you see the word gin on the end of a word, that means it gives rise to. So gives rise to means it's not active. It's released. Pepsinogen is converted to pepsin, which is the active form that actually can break protein bonds apart because of the lower pH of acid. We need to stop now and move on to the next lecture series.